Hello again, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis. We talk about journalism here on this program, and today, well, why not? We're going to talk about the history of journalism, because if you want to talk about where journalism is today, you got to know where it's been. So we have a special guest with us today, somebody who's written a very interesting and informative book called Chicago Journalism History. Wayne Klatt is with us today. His first glimpses of a newsroom came when the Chicago Tribune printed 4 of his essays while he was a junior in high school. And then he worked as a reporter and a writer and editor for the City News Bureau for quite some time, as we're going to learn. Chicago journalism is framed against the larger landscape of American media and the ways that technologies and mergers have already altered news gathering and presenting. It's the kind of stuff we talk about all the time on our program here. We consider daily operations of the newspapers and broadcast stations, and we consider how they've changed with the times. And as I said, if you really want to know how they've changed with the times, you need to go back to about, 1833 or something like that.
Yeah.
Hi, Wayne. Welcome to the program.
Glad to be here.
So there's an image of the Chicago Tribune, which has been around for pretty much all of this time.
Yeah.
There's an image you paint, and for no particular reason, I'd like to kind of start there, of a blind donkey or something walking around in circles. Tell us what the printing plant used to be like.
Oh, the printing plant was in the lower floor of the Tribune Tower, and you could go there. They even conducted tours, and you would see the presses rolling. And you can hear the presses up on the 4th floor where the editorial offices were. The editorial refers to the news gathering portion of the paper. And you can see the newspapers coming off in sheets like this, and it was something great to see. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, there are some Hollywood movies that show the printing plants. They all looked pretty much alike.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking, though, of what there was an image that you had early on in the early 1800s, right after the paper was, like maybe one of the first times it changed hands, where the new buyer came in and found that the press was being run by a donkey or something, or?
Yeah, it was just it was a horse going around in circles, and this was high tech at that time.
So the horse would run some kind of mechanism that would operate the presses somehow.
Yeah, well, it beat hand presses unless you were the horse.
Hoof press, yeah.
And
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to say that nowadays the presses are removed from the news offices, and they have computerized what's called pagination, which prepares the pages for the newspapers. Mm-hmm. And everything is done by computer, which is both good and bad.
Yes, I'm sure we all know about everything. All our lives are done by computer, which is good and bad.
Yeah.
So part of the reason why I really wanted to have you come by and talk to us today is because there is as you know, there's just a huge debate going on right now about journalism and the news media and where things are going. Mm-hmm. And I'm a very strong believer that you can't really figure out where you're going until you know where you've been. And the thing that I think we kind of get hung up on is that most of us have come up in a time when journalism, it was a kind of a professional class of people. I mean, certainly in the last 20 to 30 years, journalists, reporters are seen as people who have college educations, who have a lot of skills and try to be fair and balanced, at least for the most part, in their reporting. But it just was not ever thus. Reporters didn't come from that background.
Well, we're talking. If we want to talk about like 1920, a homeless boy might be found sleeping on rolls of newsprint in the basement of a newspaper. And maybe a guy will say, "Do you want a job?" And he becomes a copy boy. And if he's a good copy boy, they send him out to fires or accidents, and he becomes a reporter or he becomes a photographer, and they give him a camera. They might not tell him how to operate the camera, and he's got to work it out himself. But he goes out and might have an 8th grade education, maybe less. Some were really ignorant. They had great street smarts, but they could not write a story. They would just turn in their stories to what were then called rewrite men. And rewrite men were reporters who were no longer on the street, but they would just write up these stories. This is about breaking news. This is not about political reporting. That's something else again.
But I guess the thing that, when we think of corporate news media, not only newspapers, but now, of course, obviously broadcast and everything, we think about this idea that somewhere along the line, we got this idea that journalism is supposed to be objective, I guess is the word everybody uses. But your book just so deliciously talks about a period when objectivity, nobody even, that word hadn't even been invented yet. I mean, it's like you've got a reason. You've got to be out there because you've got to elect this guy. You've got to get this thing, this bond issue passed, whatever it is. And your paper is just hammer and tong out there crusading for this.
Well, newspapers, many newspapers were founded by people who had political interests. In fact, 2 publishers became mayors of Chicago, John Wentworth and Joseph Medill. And the Modern Tribune was founded to advocate the freeing of the slaves. And it later advocated electing Lincoln. But the concept of objectivity started with the Associated Press, because it wanted to send out news that would be used in papers across the country, Democratic, Republican, whatever. And this concept of objectivity kind of just slowly was adopted by the papers themselves, and they stopped going after personal crusades. And along with that came a concept of professionalism, which was unheard of previously. Before, local journalism was a game, and it was a hell of a game. Young reporters stole photographs from the homes of relatives. Ben Hecht, I don't claim that he stopped at chimney to smoke out a family so he could get in. And Art Patak phoned in a phony raid to empty a restaurant so that he could steal a photograph.
One of the things that, I mean, the book is worth reading just for the, I don't know where you got these hundreds of examples of people stealing photographs and intercepting telegraph communications one way or another, climbing up poles and connecting to wires so that they can steal the information. It's a hugely entertaining thing, but it's also incredibly instructive, because I think we tend to think today differently of the history of journalism, but the history that you tell is so radically different than what we kind of imagine journalism to be today. And that's really, I just think that's really important to understand.
Well, you can respect newspapers more now. There's no longer fabrication of news, and you have to, even when you withhold a source, you have to give proof to the editor about your source, who the source is, and things like that. It's just that it's not as much fun to work at them.
It's not as much fun. Well, you just tossed off a little line there that I think we need to go back and pick up, because you weren't kidding when you said they don't just make up news, or at least, the real newspapers don't just make up news anymore. But that happened all the time. Yeah.
One of the most famous is the Indian rope trick, which was created by a Tribune reporter about a Swami, that is a guy from India who would play a flute and the rope would go up. And that has been used in all sorts of fiction, and it's believed that it really happened, or that many people believe it, which is a hoax. That's probably the most famous
Just something he made up.
Yeah.
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 Well, now, but moving just slightly, it's not really a long distance to go back to when you said that one of the original founding purposes of the Tribune was to elect Lincoln.
Yeah.
I had known that. I think anybody who's a student of journalism and, of Joseph Medill and all that would have known that. But what I didn't understand is that so much of Lincoln's campaign was literally written in the newsroom at the Tribune.
Yeah.
Lincoln would go to the office and sit down with the editors, and they'd write a speech for him. I mean, that just seems preposterous today.
President Roosevelt had a number of people who would come and write speeches for him. But that was a little different, because they were writing speeches for someone who was, they knew. They were just furthering what Roosevelt spoke about. But Medill largely created Lincoln.
Yeah, I mean, that's the impression that I get from this, is that Lincoln was really kind of just another, kind of guy. He was a politician, but Medill decided, we're going to make you president of the United States. We're going to, and not everything was above board that they did to get him elected.
Oh no, they packed the convention hall called the Wigwam with seats, and he made deals. Lincoln would not allow any deal making, but he stayed home. And so they pushed him through, and then Medill sort of forgot about Lincoln after Lincoln was elected and occasionally turned on him. He was just interested in having a Republican candidate as president. The Republican Party at the time expressed the interests of what was called the Midwest. And that's what it was
anti-slavery
important. Yeah, it needed to further the interests of the Midwest, also freeing the slaves, which also would further the interests of the Midwest.
And so the Tribune just became a kind of a moving force in that.
Yeah, and Medill had a dynamic personality. Even if you didn't like him, you had to admire him, because he saw everything through. He didn't leave it up to underlings. And when the Great Chicago Fire broke out, he went up on the roof to help put out the flames for as long as he could, personally. I don't know of any editor who would do that nowadays.
That's probably a good point. But it's interesting to me that I couldn't help but think, as I'm reading this, that the tens of thousands of young people who've gone through the Medill School of Journalism might not actually have any idea that Joseph Medill probably didn't stand for a lot of the things that they're being taught in their very school today.
I think the editor who was the most influential and admirable in his interests was the main editor of the Daily News. He laid out what kind of stories he wanted his reporters to find out, such as he wanted to clear up corruption in City Hall. So a City Hall reporter was set to work looking for corruption. He didn't wait for corruption evidence to come across. And I think this is one thing that's lacking today.
Well, I think you're bringing up really, this is kind of getting to the heart of the discussion for me, because you draw a very interesting sort of a timeline here that I really had never put together in my own mind before. That up until a certain point, the newspapers and the city officials were really kind of one and the same. I mean, kind of drawing, I guess, from the Medill thing of, you know, yeah, well, we also created a president. But the cop shop reporters were kind of adjunct cops in a lot of ways. I mean, they were all kind of on the same side. And then, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the way I read what you're saying is that really that tradition carried on in some way or another almost all the way until 1968. That it is during the riots in Chicago that the news media and the police have a kind of an irreparable split.
Yeah, it was still that way when I started as a reporter. I started in 1963, so that was 5 years before the anti-war demonstrations. And our boss at the city news service would not put out anything that made the police look bad, even though our reporters turned in stories of police beating the demonstrators. And one of our own reporters was clubbed on the head just because he was tall. We couldn't put that out. And the same boss told his editors to call the FBI whenever we learned about a meeting of anti-war groups, which we wouldn't do. But yeah, the idea is that local politicians would let the reporters have information provided they didn't find out anything embarrassing. Same thing with the police.
So there was this kind of, again, we have an entirely different expectation about the news media today than existed even, as you say, as recently as 40 years ago. That that reporters often just kind of felt like they were there to sort of help the people that they were covering, to get their story out. And but I mean, the idea today that an editor could say to, you know, to a reporter, no, you can't report the fact that our reporters are out there getting clubbed by the police. I mean, that would be tweeted and would be out within nanoseconds of it happening today. It's just it's amazing to me to consider, as you do so well in your book, the number of changes that have happened in 20 to 30 to 40 years, how radically different the environment is. And you, of course, not only chronicle it in the book, but you actually lived through a lot of it.
Yeah, I was at a police station when they brought in a suspected child molester, and they told me to leave the second floor. And when I came back up sometime later, they claimed they never had the suspect in custody. In other words, they were beating him, and they didn't want me to hear it. But and I had no story. So
what did you do?
Couldn't do anything. I told my editor. And contrary to the movies, you have to tell the editor everything.
Right.
You have to tell them where you are. You have to call in every now and then to see if there are any questions. You don't do anything until the editor approves it.
Yeah. We're talking today on Chicago Newsroom with Wayne Klatt, who is the author of this most interesting book, Chicago Journalism, A History. He told me that the reason he wrote it is because that there were other versions that weren't as accurate, or something like that, right? You felt like you had to correct the record.
They didn't let facts get in the way of a good story.
So now we have what I think will probably exist for a long time in journalism schools and in other places of academia as a kind of a sort of a marker in the geography of Chicago journalism. So let's talk a little bit about electronic media, because we want to try to tie all of this together. I'm fascinated by the fact that you point out that radio comes on the scene, obviously, in 1920, 21, 22. But for the first few years in Chicago, news media, meaning the newspapers, basically just didn't pay any attention to radio. They didn't feel like they wanted to be part of it.
There was an agreement between the papers and the radio stations, that the radio stations would not break any news, that everything would be left to the newspapers. And this ended the day that John Dillinger was killed in Chicago. And Norman Thomas Sr. was hosting a dance show, I think. It was a musical show, and he heard about it, and he announced it on the air. And from then on, the broadcast stations and the newspapers were enemies. That lasted until the newspapers started stealing news from the radio and TV stations, just like the radio and TV stations stole news from the newspapers.
Had been doing it to them.
Now it's hard to tell them apart sometimes.
Right. Many of them share newsrooms. Yeah. So, but you also point out something that I think is interesting, and I think many people watching the show today certainly were around for this, that there was a period in the 80s when television really did become the dominant journalism in Chicago. I'm not just talking about news now. I'm talking about doing real journalism.
It was great to see Channel 2 and Channel 7 had competition, and they sent news teams out to the scenes of whatever was happening. And the newscasts were actually exciting, but then there was new management at all of the networks, and that meant changes in the newsrooms. They cut down on the number of reporters and the type of reporting that they did, and there was no longer any competition. And so news became bland. That is, television news became bland, just like Las Vegas and Los Angeles.
Yeah, I think we're all familiar with that period when the consultants came in and started introducing happy talk and saying, you know, people had to be pretty to be on TV and all that. But I think that your account of it is really interesting because it kind of lets us see it happening from behind the scenes and how. There really were people in television, and I'm sure there are many today, but there was a generation of people in television who really believed in television and journalism in the same sentence.
Oh yeah.
And that is something that certainly doesn't exist in the same way today.
Yeah, there was a personal commitment not to presentation, but to the news itself. Now we have the news readers who are very good at what they do, but there's not any involvement in the stories.
But as you say, what happened by the 80s and the 90s is that we start seeing that really kind of radio, for all effects and purposes, gets out of the business of news by the end of the 90s. There are almost no radio in Chicago doing real news anymore. And television has been kind of chased out of the business, and newspapers are finding their audiences declining and declining. So what does this mean to a veteran news guy like yourself? Where are people getting news? What's happening?
Well, what's happening is like the end of Rocky II, where both fighters collapse in the ring. The radio and TVs and the newspapers are kind of down. But of course there's Rocky 3 and 4 and then on. So I think that news is going to be reconceptualized. Right now we get little blurbs off the internet, but that's not very satisfying. And I don't know where everything is going. But right now it's probably in a state of transition. I don't think it's in decline because we still have an interest in news. It's just that one thing I think that we should pursue more, and that is the why. It used to be the 5 whys: who, what, where, when, and why. And that's become the 4 W's
it's
now.
Now 4 W's. Nobody's got time to ask why
Well, asking why leads to problems for lawyers. You know, you can't say that, or you will offend that kind of person.
Well, now, you know, one of the things that a lot of us who are very interested in this whole topic of journalism, that we've been kind of whining about for the last couple of years is that the first people who got thrown overboard were the editors. We just sort of lost the ability to give the news that extra pair of eyes before it was distributed to the public, because now everybody is a reporter, everybody is a citizen journalist or a blogger, or so that kind of that extra step of applying the 5 W's and asking the question and saying, no, go back out and check that if your mother says she loves you, kind of thing. Do you regret that? Do you lament that? Or are we just being nostalgic?
I regret it entirely. But we're not going to go back to that stage. I'm not sure, well, I'm repeating myself, I'm not sure where we're going.
But that that thing of inserting the editor in there, that is gone?
Yeah, well, there were 3 stages in let's say in the 1960s. There were the reporters, there were the rewrites who just took notes and made stories out of them. And then there were the editors who guided them all and who worked long hours, who would kind of camp out at the place if there was breaking news. But along the line, all of the there are no more rewrites in Chicago, and very few, I would imagine, anywhere in the country. They're just the reporters and then the editors who double up as copy editors. It's not the same thing. The editors are looking, double checking the facts, but they're not shepherding the story through. And that's one of the reasons why the news is so monotonous now.
Yeah.
Or the presentation of the news.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we didn't call you here today because we wanted you to give us the answer, because we know no one has it. But in order to find the answer, you have to know some of the facts about the past, and you've presented them so well in this book, and I want to thank you very much for doing this book, Wayne. It's a really wonderful book. Chicago Journalism, A History. And you've been watching Chicago Newsroom, a community service of CAN TV. You know, of course, that you can find us all here on cable, but you can also see this and other programs free online at cantv.blip.tv, or you can subscribe using iTunes. So check us out. We are multi-platformed. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks so much for joining us today on Chicago Newsroom.